It's on. Okay, good morning. Welcome to the one of the first morning sessions. And my name is Lesya Verchenko. I am assistant professor and academic director at Kyiv School of Economics. And I will be chairing this session. And today we have three very, very interesting papers in this session. All three of those are devoted to political economy. And we are going to start with a paper by Coupe and Maksym Obrizan, who are both KC professors. And the paper is devoted to violence, liberation, and voting. So I'm going to pass the floor to Tom.
Thank you. And I'm going to try to walk around. So, okay. First important note. This is really still work in progress, so it's not for citation and not for tweets either. And I'm sure that Scott will, after the presentation, point out all the weak issues of this paper. So before you start tweeting it, listen to Scott first. Also, this is a very sensitive issue. We are aware of it. Especially kind of whatever word you use here can be misinterpreted. So if we do something wrong, apologies to start with. Okay, the origin of this paper is a column in Vox Ukraine, which was on why the Ukrainian army received a cold welcome in the liberated towns of the east. Basically, this column was making the point that, well, kind of when the soldiers entered or liberated some of the towns in eastern Ukraine, the people weren't very happy because of the violence that was used in eastern Ukraine. And so that's kind of started kind of in our mind a discussion and some ideas about kind of how does violence affect the opinion of people, and how, in our case, how violence does affect the voting behavior of people. And we focus on voting behavior because this voting behavior is probably linked to the chance that the eastern parts of Ukraine recover after peace sets in. Because if you look at the economic literature, it says that kind of economic growth depends on social capital, and often voting is linked, and participating in voting is linked to social capital. And also that kind of the recovery after violence is often linked to how stable that peace is, how the stability of the peace is perceived. Kind of, again, this is also related probably to the voting. So, just to give a little bit of background. So, we had the Maidan revolution. There was already some violence at that point, but then, kind of, in the beginning of April, in a number of eastern Ukrainian towns, some militants are occupying buildings. Initially, there is no reaction of the Ukrainian government, but then from middle of April, the Ukrainian government decides to intervene in a military way in those areas, and this leads to lots of violence. Kind of just to give you a little summary, kind of from a report of the United Nations, the Commissioner for Human Rights, from middle of April till middle of September 2014, many people died. Part of it is, well, a lot of civilians died, kind of due to indiscriminate shelling, due to kind of the violence that takes place within the cities. And, well, it's not only, well, kind of all parties kind of participate in the violence. Then we get September 5, the Minsk Agreement, temporary peace agreement, and then we have the parliamentary election. So we have kind of this whole time period of violence, and then we have elections. We have kind of voting, and that's what we're going to kind of relate to each other. We're going to relate all this violence to this voting in the parliamentary elections. So kind of we have three related questions. We try to be quite comprehensive. And we have different data sets that try to answer these different, or that try to address these different questions. First, we're going to look at how the evaluation of violence by people outside the directly affected areas affects their participation in the elections, their turnout decisions, and also the decisions about for whom they will vote. And then we will focus on the areas that are directly affected by the violence. And we will look at kind of individual level data and try to see how the personal experience of violence affects voter turnout and voter decisions. And then we also look at polling station level data, where we also can try to see how liberation and violence affected voter turnout and voter choice. So there are kind of quite a lot of questions, and quite a lot of answers we hope to. So first, kind of some background on the literature. There's quite a lot of literature on how voting is influenced by violence. There are typically, or if you look at the literature, there are the people who look at the violence by what I would call non-state actors. Sometimes called the separatists, the terrorists. So this I would call the non-state actors. And for example, there's a study for Turkey that tries to see how the villages where soldiers of the Turkish army were buried after they had been killed by PKK, how these villages vote differently from the villages where no such soldiers were buried. In Israel, there are lots of studies that look at how the regions that are affected by the violence, how they vote, how the Israeli villages that are affected by rockets, for example, how do they vote compared to other villages in Israel that are not affected by that violence. There are several papers on how the Spanish voters reacted on the Madrid bombings in the beginning of the 2000s. I would say if you summarize this literature, and there's also the conclusion of some international study that looks at elections in over 100 countries, several hundreds of elections, that basically find that if there is a terrorist act, if there is an act of violence in a given year, then, and there's also an election in that year, that typically the government party loses. So typically you get a change in the cabinet after there is violence. So that's who wins, who loses. Then there's also some literature on the turnout. How does it affect turnout? I think typically people would react okay, if you have violence, this destroys social capital, so people will not go to vote anymore. However, there are a number of papers that seem to suggest that violence leads to an increase in turnout rather than to a decrease in turnout. So there's some studies for Sierra Leone where people who were affected by the violence are more likely to become politically active. There is a study by some Belgian researchers on Uganda that find that regions where there was violence, there is more political discussion in those regions. Again, also for Spain, after the Madrid bombings, there was an increase in turnout. And again, there is an international cross-country study that confirms this. If there is a terrorist action, if there is terrorist violence, you typically get an increase in turnout. There is, I think, much less literature on the effect of state violence. So the previous studies were typically of how do people react on non-state actors' violence, terrorists, separatists. There's much less literature on how people react on violence, military violence by the state. There's some papers on Colombia where they look at the paramilitary violence. There's a study on Afghanistan where they find that violence, or people who were victims of these international forces, they are then more likely to support the Taliban. While if the people get victims or become victims of Taliban violence, they are less likely to support the Taliban, but they're not more likely to support the international forces. There is also some literature on that is called the rally around the flag literature that looks at how people react when in a major crisis the government makes some very drastic, dramatic decisions. For example, the country goes to war. And then the idea is that if the government does something dramatic, something serious, then people tend to rally around the flag. Means they will start voting, they will start voting for the government, to support the government in those tough actions. In Ukraine, if you look at the overall situation, in fact, maybe a bit surprisingly, if you look at the literature, the turnout declined. Compared to 2012, 2012 was about 57%. In 2014, we got a decline in the turnout to 52%. And not just in the eastern parts of Ukraine. It's basically throughout Ukraine, in almost all the oblasts, you get a decrease in turnout.
Presidential or parliamentary?
Parliamentary. Of course, the parties changed a lot. If you compare the 2012 parties to the 2014 parties, there's a total change there. So there's a lot of change in the parties, a bit surprising evolution in terms of turnout. But rather than looking at this overall situation in Ukraine, we're going to go into more details. So first we're going to look at how people in those regions that were not directly affected by the violence, how do they react, or how do they behave, and how do they interpret this violence. So we have a survey by the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, which was done in Ukraine at the beginning of September. So it's basically just after the Minsk agreements, just after major episodes of violence, and a month before the parliamentary elections. They interviewed face-to-face 1,613 Ukrainians in those areas not affected by the violence, so it's not Crimea, not Luhansk, and not Donetsk Oblast. And they ask interesting questions, like, kind of, what do you think about the use of violence by the government? And do you think there was enough violence or not enough violence? And if you look at kind of Ukraine, I call it Ukraine without those areas where there was violence, 47% says there was not enough, 10% says too much, 11% says there are appropriate levels of violence used by the administration. A sizable amount of people don't express a clear opinion. So what we're now going to do is we're going to try to see whether there's a difference between those groups in terms of kind of their voting behavior, in terms of whom they vote for, in terms of whether or not they vote for, or whether or not they vote. So, because for example, there's also a question, kind of how likely is it that you will participate in the elections? And if many people said they were very likely to participate, some people volunteered and said we are not going to vote at all, and then we have this gradation. So as you can see here, we have kind of an ordered variable from very not going to vote to very likely to vote. So we model this using an ordered probit regression, and just to give you an initial starting point, we just make this regression, we correlate the decision or the intention to vote to how people perceived the level of violence used by the government. So it's ordered probit regression. Just to give you some indication, all the bold numbers mean they're significant at the 5% level. We find, for example, that compared to people who didn't know or who didn't have a clear opinion about the level of violence, those people who said that appropriate force was used, they are 3% less likely not to vote. So they're 3% more likely to vote. Similarly, kind of, if they said too little force, they are 4% less likely not to vote. If they said too much force was used, they are much more likely not to vote. Or at the other side, kind of, if you look at the chance that they will say that they very likely will vote, if they find that too much force was used, minus 70 percentage point chance that they will say that they are very likely to vote. So there's a huge difference in terms of the likelihood of saying that they will participate in the elections, depending on how they evaluate. Is used, they are going to vote. Of course, this is kind of just a very simple regression, no control variables. We get significant. Many other factors affect this decision to vote or not to. So then we kind of add some control variables. Nicely for this data set is we know whether or not they voted in the past. So we know whether or not they participated in the elections, because you could say that people who are always participating in the election, they will also participate this time. We have indicators about how they perceived Maidan. So we have whether they opposed Maidan or not. Okay, yes. Whether they opposed Maidan or not. And we have also some evaluations on of the economy, kind of whether they think the economy was doing good or bad and so on. So what do we find? Of course, people who voted before are much more likely to vote also in 2014. What we find, the position or the evaluations towards the Maidan revolution is a very strong predictor of whether or not people will participate in the elections. So it's clear kind of, if people strongly opposed Maidan, they are 7% likely to vote. If they are strongly supporters of the Maidan revolution, they are 20% more likely to vote. Economic situation did not correlate much with the intention to vote. Once we include these extra variables, this is what happens to the force variables. Almost all of them lose significance. The only one that is still somewhat significant is there is too much force. If people think too much force is used, they're 6% less likely to turn out. But it's not significant at the 5% level. If we do a probit regression, where we just compare somewhat likely and very likely to the others, it's also not significant. So our kind of conclusion from this part is this seems to suggest that there is little correlation between the turnout and the violence and the interpretation of violence based on this data set. They also asked for whom people would vote if the elections were today. And so we kind of, well, many of them say we don't know yet, so we only will use those people who actually said that they had already made up their mind. So it's about half of the sample, and we just divide parties among two groups, the pro kind of Western parties and the pro-Russian parties. And in this data set, most of the people, and also in the elections, most voted for pro-Western parties. What do we find there? If we include no other variables except the force variables, we find some evidence that indeed kind of the people who thought that too much force was used, they are more likely to vote for pro-Russian parties. Kind of 30% more likely to vote for pro-Russian parties, 30% less likely to vote for pro-Western parties. Similarly, if people think that too little force was used, then they are more likely to vote for the pro-Western parties. If we include these extra control variables, this remains. If we include even more variables, all kind of characteristics, all kind of demographic characteristics, this remains. So our kind of conclusion here would be the evaluation of violence in those parts of Ukraine that were not directly affected by the violence did not affect turnout that much, but it had a bigger impact on whom people voted for. You could argue, okay, this turnout and whom people will vote for has to be modeled jointly. We tried that, but it doesn't change much to the results. Right. So that's kind of our first conclusion based on kind of how people behaved in the rest of Ukraine. Now we're going to focus on kind of those parts of Ukraine that were directly affected by the violence. For this, we first will look at the survey that was done in two cities that were kind of heavily affected by the violence, Kramatorsk and Slovyansk. And the Ilko Kucherev Democratic Initiatives Foundation did a survey there of 500 people in Kramatorsk and 500 people in Slovyansk a month after the elections. And they were asking them about kind of whether they were affected by the violence in one way or another. So we categorize the different ways of being affected by the violence as property damage, basically people who said that their residence was destroyed, partly destroyed, or some of their property was stolen. Then we have physical damages, basically people who got injured, it's a very small part, or people who say they know somebody who was injured or who was killed among their close relatives or friends. And then there are all kind of inconvenience. People who say, okay, well, I didn't have electricity, I didn't have water, that kind of things. And then there are about 30% of the people who say they were not affected at all. And so we have kind of 13% property damage, 18% physical damage, many people who said there was some kind of an inconvenience, and then people who said they were not affected at all. And again, what we're going to do is we're going to try to see whether there are differences in voting behavior between these different kinds of people. People who voted, well, about half said that they voted, about half said that they didn't vote. So this is retrospectively. They already voted on October 26th. This survey is then done in November. So what do we find here? This is just a probit regression because we have just one or zero. So what do we find? That we find that different kinds of damage have different kinds of implications. For example, we find that people who said that they had physical damage, they are less likely to vote. But those people who kind of say they were touched by some other inconvenience, they're more likely to vote. This is if we don't include any other variables again. So this is just a variable without any control variables. They also asked those people who didn't vote why they didn't vote. And those people who said they suffered some kind of inconvenience, they were more likely to say that they didn't think elections were relevant. If we include other determinants, what remains is that, well, other inconvenience disappears. So once you control for things like age, education, all kind of demographic controls, inconvenience don't matter anymore. The only thing that still matters is physical damage. Those people who were touched by physical damage are less likely to go to the polling station. The difference between those two columns is that in the second column, we also included a variable called support. And I think, well, I had something here. So we include also a variable that indicates whether or not people received charitable support. So people suffer, then about 25% of the people got support from the government, from some charitable organizations. And we try to see how that affected their turnout. And we find that those people who received support are much more likely to turn out. And we then also try to interact this turnout decision, the turnout decision, or the damage that they suffered, with whether or not they received support. And what we find is that those people that didn't receive support, they will react negatively to damage, both for property and physical damage. But those people that received support afterwards, for them there is no problem anymore. They are as likely to go to the polls as the others. Which at least is some suggestive evidence that by providing support afterwards, the negative feelings to some extent can be compensated for, or can be undone. Which I think is kind of an interesting finding. Of course, one of the problems with all these stories is that we always look at correlation, and there can always be, and correlation doesn't mean causality. And maybe there are other factors, rather than the factors that we include in our regression, that drive these results. And one way to kind of investigate this to some extent is to see whether violence is random. If violence is random, it doesn't correlate with other factors, then we might indeed find the causal effect of violence. So here what we did is we did a regression of these different kind of these different kinds of damage to all kind of explanatory variables. And while most variables do not explain damage, here and there we find some significant coefficients. So which suggests that violence was not totally random. Which also kind of corresponds to kind of, if you look at what happened at some point in Sloviansk, the citizens were asked to report on the Ukrainian speakers. Or there were reports that Romas were specifically targeted by DNR people. So there is some evidence also, not only in the data, but also kind of in what we read in the press, of non-random violence. So, conclusion of this first part in terms of turnout, kind of physical damage goes together with a decreased turnout, also to some extent property damage, but support can to some extent undo this. Then we also look at whom they voted for. Again, we find that different kind of damages have different effects. Physical damage, other inconvenience, does not have an effect on whom people vote for, but property damage makes people more likely to vote for pro-Ukrainian parties. Similar kind of people of Ukrainian nationality, or who say they are Ukrainian nationals, are more likely to vote for pro-Western parties. Older people are less likely to vote for pro-Western parties. Other inconveniences is less significant, but also a negative effect. I didn't mention that. So, conclusion so far, if you look at the rest of Ukraine that wasn't directly affected, we get not that much effect on turnout, but a bigger effect on whom people vote for. The effect of violence depends on what kind of violence has been used. Not what kind of violence, what kind of damage has been suffered. has some effect both on turnout and on whom people vote for. Now I will give the floor to Maksym, who will talk about the polling stations.
Okay, so now I will talk about evidence related to the polling stations. So in particular, we will first of all concentrate only on these two regions, Donetsk and Lugansk, that were most affected by the situation. And we will look at two things. First of all, how people voted, how many of them showed up for the polling stations between the two parliamentary elections, and also how their preferences for pro-Western parties changed. Okay, so we have defined four variables of interest. So first of all, the variable which is called liberation after occupation. Again, if it's politically sensible, you can change the order. But the idea here is that we wanted to look at the stations that participated in parliamentary elections that were later, but did not participate in earlier presidential elections. And the idea here is that Ukrainian government would need a lot of control over the territories to have elections, right? So if they didn't have presidential elections but had parliamentary elections, then there was some liberation. Of course, the problem here is that we cannot really say whether the effect comes from liberation or occupation because they are indistinguishable. And this will be our interpretation. So whatever was the main reason, we don't know, but the conclusion will be dependent on this variable. In terms of violence indicators, we have found three. I mean, we actually found more, but these three were seem to be the most actually accurate. Let's put it this way. So one of them was weaponry destroyed. There is a website where there are posted photos of tanks and other heavy artillery and other weaponry, and we linked this website to the locations. For example, if there was a tank destroyed next to Sloviansk, then Sloviansk will have an indication of weaponry destroyed 1. If there was no such weapon destroyed, it will be 0. And there are two wiki pages for military casualties and civilian casualties. There are numbers of people who were killed in that particular region or city. And again, we linked those numbers of casualties to the polling stations. So now let's look at the descriptive statistics. So first of all, we can observe that only about 40% of polling stations in Donetsk region voted in 2014 elections compared to 2012, and only about 30% of Lugansk polling stations participated in 2014 elections. And also, if you look at the turnout here, there is a substantial drop in the turnout, right, between the two elections. Of course, one possible interpretation could be that the elections were not quite honestly counted in 2012, right, and the turnout may be actually fake. That was in 2012. And you can see that quite a large number of polling stations was affected by either violence or liberation or occupation. And part of the reason is that, of course, cities would have a lot of polling stations, right? So there are like about 40 in Kramatorsk, I think, and that's why we will use clustered standard errors at the level of the city. So here is the first set of results. Well, first of all, we did a simple OLS, right, where we indicated the variable of interest, how the voter turnout changed between 2014-2012, and we included all of the measures that we have defined, right? What you can find here is that essentially what was more important for change in turnout is liberation or occupation. And potentially the reason for this may be because people just left the areas, or maybe they were afraid to vote when it happened. We were not quite satisfied with these definitions of violence, right? Because they are kind of very they're incomplete. So what we did next, we combined them together, right? So we created a new variable which is called any violence, and it would take value of 1 if there was any weapon destroyed or any civilian casualties or any military casualties, and then we just did actually first difference regression for turnout change versus liberation and violence and across term. And what you can see here again is that essentially for voter turnout, violence did not matter as much as liberation or occupation. And in principle, about 40% of a decline in turnout was caused by or associated with the liberation or occupation of this area, right? Compared to those regions that were not occupied and not liberated correspondingly. Violence appears to be relatively unimportant for voter turnout, and this actually concerns like a simple OLS and actually diff regression. But since turnout has changed, we decided to control for turnout in the future regressions for the pro-Western support that I will talk about next. Well, the question about voting preferences, it's a bit controversial and it's difficult because many of the winners of 2014 elections didn't even exist in 2012, right? So what we did, we decided with Tom to define these broad measures of pro-Western parties versus pro-Russian parties. And what you can see from the data is that support for pro-Western parties actually increased by about 20%. And what's actually surprising is that support increased even in Donetsk and Lugansk regions, which are typically strongholds for pro-Russian parties, right? So we want to explore again for Donetsk and Lugansk regions how violence and liberation affected support for pro-Western parties. I report you three regressions, right? So the first regression will be again first difference for just change in pro-Western support, and the base category here is pro-Russian support. So we dropped parties that could not be identified as one of the two, and we dropped people who vote against everybody. Results are similar if you keep them in, but I think that interpretation, we actually think that interpretation might be better if you drop them. And then, as Tom already said, and actually as the previous literature says, liberation of villages may be more random than liberation of cities, right? Because cities may be liberated for some random, for some strategic reasons, right? When it comes to the village, you know, it's really more or less random where it's end up on which side of the front line. And finally, I also added, with the help of Tom, the variables on unemployment and real wages change to see how economic variables change support for pro-Western parties. And so here are my results, our results, sorry. So first of all, observe that the number of observations for the entire sample is 1387. So this is the number of polling stations. Again, it's clustered at the level of the city, right? There are about 651 clusters. There are about 633 villages, and if we include economic variables, what we observe is that there is a smaller number of them because some of the data is not available. I mean, it was a big problem for us to get the data. Actually, we have in Lugansk to get these economic variables. Okay, so let's talk first about just the standard OLS regression. So here the picture is actually different, right? So here violence substantially reduced pro-Western support. So if you look at the constant here, the intercept, about 29% more support for pro-Western parties. But it goes down by about 11 percentage points in the cities or in the polling stations that were affected by the violence, where there are people killed or some heavy weaponry destroyed. The next one, again, the results would be different if you look just at villages, right? So the picture is kind of completely different. And again, this might actually correspond to some anecdotal evidence about where pro-Western support is stronger, right, in this part of the country. And from our results, it looks like violence actually supported and increased support for pro-Western parties. When you compare these two models, the first model, it's more extensive, it probably has more external validity. The second model maybe is better identified, right? Because probably villages are more likely to be liberated more randomly. And the final piece here deals with economic variables. Again, we have a reduced sample size, so it cannot be directly compared to the first model. And well, unemployment may actually increase unemployment between the two elections may actually increase support for pro-Western parties. But the results are significant only at 10%. Okay, so here are the conclusions for this part. Surprisingly, that we find a huge increase in pro-Western support even in Donbass region. Liberation does not matter much here as violence does for pro-Western support. And actually, if there is a violence in the area, it can reduce support for pro-Western parties by about a third of this total increase. However, if you consider just a subsample of villages, it's completely different picture. So obviously, if you go just for the cities, you'll find even more decline in pro-Western support. And final results, it's higher unemployment. So economics also here plays a role. So higher unemployment may lead to higher pro-Western support in this area. But again, the result might be statistically weak. It's just 10% significance. And I would ask Tom to complete our presentation.
Well, I'll end by saying, and if this is still very much work in progress. We have lots of conclusions. Some are conflicting with each other. That's part of the work in progress. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So this is a fascinating paper of normative importance situated in an obviously interesting and hugely important empirical context. I was glad to have had the chance to read it. And I'm sure there are a lot of folks in the government, possibly in this audience, who would love to know how violence, in fact, has affected voting behavior. So the stakes are high to getting this right. And as the authors have noted, there are some challenges to the research design, essentially 3 different research designs in this paper. And so with this in mind, my comments, what I'm going to do is walk through each of the 3 main exercises in the paper, discuss various empirical challenges, and offer a few suggestions. Okay, so the first exercise in the paper uses polling data from unoccupied Ukraine about 6 weeks before the parliamentary elections last year. And so the basic exercise using these data is to regress intended turnout and intended party choice on views of the appropriateness of force. And so just to remind ourselves, the main findings from this exercise are that attitudes towards force do not seem to affect turnout, and that those who like force are more likely to vote for pro-Western parties, or more likely to say that they'll vote for pro-Western parties. So I'm just focusing in my description of the findings, I'm just going to focus on the regressions with various controls. So I don't find the regressions that are, let's say, essentially bivariate to be terribly convincing, and so I'm just going to move straight to those. And probably in terms of presentation in the paper, it probably makes most sense to just focus on those regressions in which various variables have been conditioned on. Okay, so the empirical challenge with this research design is that there's a concern, and this is a concern that I think has been around in the political science literature since roughly the 1980s, that policy preferences may be driven by party or candidate preferences rather than the opposite. So this could be driven by information asymmetries between candidates and voters, for example. So voters are poorly informed. They assume that candidates are better informed. And so if a candidate whom they like for some other reason says that they support a particular policy, then voters in turn say that they're more likely to support that policy themselves. Alternatively, this could simply be driven by a desire on the part of voters to reduce cognitive dissonance. So I thought I supported this policy, but then my guy says that he supports something else, and so I'm going to bring all of this in line in my head by changing my policy views. Okay, so there are various solutions in the literature to this problem, including what in the literature are known as cross-lag models, in which one regresses votes on lagged attitudes and attitudes on lagged votes. And so we probably don't have the data for that sort of fix in this particular setting. So in lieu of better research data, I'm wondering if the authors might simply just lean a bit more on interpretation. So the endogeneity of attitudes with respect to turnout is probably less likely than with respect to party choice. So it's reasonable to think that people might be bringing their policy preferences in line with their preferences with respect to particular candidates. It's less plausible to think that their desire to vote or not is going to be driving their policy preferences. And so focusing especially on the turnout regressions in this setting might make the most sense. And in this sense, it's interesting that there appears to be no significant conditional correlation between views on force and turnout, whereas we do see an effect of views on force on vote choice. And so exploiting that difference in findings in terms of where we might expect endogeneity concerns to be more or less salient seems potentially useful here. Okay, and then just one other brief comment on this research design. So I couldn't tell, I was pretty sure that there weren't region or city dummies in any of these regressions. That seems like a fairly obvious thing to add. There might be things that vary at the region or the city level that we're not picking up through observable characteristics that we could control for by just dumbing out region or city. Okay, so let me move on to the second exercise. So the second exercise, to remind ourselves, uses polling data from Slavyansk and Kramatorsk about a month after the parliamentary elections. And so the exercise here is to regress turnout and party choice on self-reported direct experiences with violence. And so the findings, the key findings from this exercise are, first of all, that physical damage, so physical is, this is the term in the literature, but it's a little bit misleading. So by physical, what we mean is, to one's physical person or the physical person of people that one knows. Physical damage reduces turnout. And second, that property damage increases support for pro-Western parties, and the inconveniences, so not having electricity, that sort of thing, possibly reduces support for pro-Western parties. Okay, so the empirical challenge with this research design is we might worry that self-reported experience with whether or not self-reported experience with direct violence is reflective of actual experience with direct violence, or are people telling us the truth when they say that a close family member or a friend has suffered personal injury, when they say that they've suffered inconveniences, that sort of thing. So unfortunately, it doesn't appear that we have any direct way to check the accuracy of the violence reports, as apparently we don't have the addresses of individuals. So in principle, if we knew where people lived and if we knew where shells were falling, then we could cross-check the direct reports with what we actually know to have been the case with respect to the incidence of violence. We don't appear to have that possibility in this case, but there is some earlier work by Jason Lyle, Graham Blair, Kosuke Imai that's cited in the paper on Afghanistan that suggests that such reports can be fairly accurate, at least in that setting, and so presumably they may be fairly accurate in this setting as well. Here it's also interesting and I think useful that the regressions of the violence indicators on various demographics indicates perhaps a little bit of correlation with things that we might expect. So older residents are more likely to have been affected. Older residents are presumably less mobile. They're more likely to just hole up in their apartments and try to sit out violence as opposed to fleeing to another city. But things that we might expect to be correlated with vote choice, like Ukrainian nationality, seem not to matter much in terms of whether or not individuals say that they've been affected by violence. Okay, so I'm more convinced by these results than I was, I think, by the results from the first exercise. But having said that, I don't understand them. So why should personal injury increase support for pro-Western parties while serious inconveniences reduces it? Okay, and so I'm not sure that I have an answer to that question, but I can imagine a way forward on this. So there's this work that we've just mentioned by Jason Leo, Graham Blair, Kosuke Imai on the effects of violence in Afghanistan. And a key finding of their work is that the effects of violence on political attitudes are conditional on the identity of the combatants. And so whether or not the violence is carried out by international security forces or by the Taliban affects how individuals view that violence and affects the impact on their political attitudes. Okay, so we could rationalize the results in this paper, the paper on Ukraine, if respondents blamed insurgents for physical damage, but blamed the government, say, for failing to keep the electricity on, which seems potentially plausible. And then, that suggests that we could think of sort of different types of violence as being carried out by different parties to the conflict. And once we think about things in those terms, it's reasonable perhaps to expect that the reaction to some types of violence may be greater, say, for ethnic Ukrainians than it is for ethnic Russians. And so that suggests some sort of interaction between the types of violence that we observe and ethnicity. Okay, so that's my suggestion for that exercise. The third exercise uses precinct-level data from Donetsk and Lugansk. The exercise here is to regress precinct-level turnout and party choice on liberation. By liberation, what we really mean, and Maksym pointed this out in his presentation, what we really mean is occupation and then liberation. So we don't know whether any effect is being driven by the fact that these areas were occupied or the fact that they were subsequently liberated. We don't observe voting behavior in areas that were occupied and not liberated because there aren't elections in those areas. At any rate, it's to regress turnout and party choice on the experience of occupation and then liberation and on the incidence of violence at the precinct level. And so the key findings here are, first of all, that liberation has a negative effect, or occupation has a negative effect on turnout, and second, that violence has a negative effect on support for pro-Western parties, but only where there's no liberation. Okay, so the empirical challenge with this research design is that even if we accept that violence is quasi-randomly assigned within population centers, as in the previous exercise with survey data from Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, it's almost certainly not quasi-randomly assigned across population centers. Yet as Tom and Maksym note in the paper, and as Maksym noted in the presentation, we may get closer to quasi-random assignment if we're focusing simply on villages rather than on cities. And so villages, sort of for largely idiosyncratic reasons, wind up on one side of the front line or the other. And so I think this suggests a couple of different approaches to working with these data that could be exploited. So my suggestion here would be to follow the approach in one of the robustness checks in the paper and just drop the cities and focus on villages close to the front line. And so I could imagine a couple of different empirical strategies when restricting attention to this sample. So first strategy might be a sort of matching strategy. So to match village precincts that were occupied with those that were not, to match them on various observables. The second might be to exploit a sort of geographic regression discontinuity. So you've got villages that are on one side of the line or the other, so treat that as a sort of discontinuity. There's some recent work by Luke Keel in political analysis that shows how this can be done. Essentially, a geographic regression discontinuity is just a regression discontinuity with two running variables, so sort of think of projecting the surface of the Earth on a plane. You've got two dimensions, and so you've got a discontinuity along those two dimensions. Okay, a few other comments on this research exercise. So, first of all, turnout declines more in liberated areas than in other areas of Donetsk and Lugansk. Is this really surprising? You have over 1 million internally displaced persons in Ukraine. Presumably there's been more displacement in areas that were occupied, and presumably those voters are still on the voting rolls. And so in that sense, this is likely just a sort of mechanical effect. It's not really about voter behavior per se. And the authors recognize that, but perhaps that's worth emphasizing. Second, something else that came up in the presentation today. So could there have been changes over time in the degree of electoral manipulation? And is it possible that that's correlated with whether or not a district was occupied and subsequently liberated? So there are ways of getting at this in the literature. Empirical strategies to try to estimate the degree of electoral manipulation. So you look at last digits, for example, so you see whether or not turnout or voting numbers, you see a disproportionate number of zeros or round numbers, that sort of thing. There are various strategies in the literature. Third, why the focus on regressions with interactive effects of liberation and violence? So I would have liked to have seen some difference results without the interaction, with just liberation and violence alone on the right-hand side, not interacted with each other. And then finally, just with respect to the sample, something that I learned from Ruben, if Ukraine works as Russia does, some of these very small polling stations may be things like hospitals where voters are registered when they leave their hospital room to vote. So it's just sort of a mechanical thing. Who's showing up to vote determines who's registered. And so you say 2, 3, 5 voters, then yeah. So this, these may be precincts that one wants to exclude from the sample.
They are excluded.
Sorry?
They are excluded. We don't have it.
You do drop them.
Yeah.
You do drop them. Okay, great. Okay, so just to conclude, again, this very important work. It has the potential to tell us a lot about the current situation in Ukraine and about the effect of violence on political behavior more generally. And I very much look forward to seeing where this goes.
Thank you, and we have about 5 minutes, I guess, till the break. So maybe Tom and Maksym want to react to this comment, so maybe we can take a couple of questions from the audience.
Questions?
Questions, okay.
Okay.
You can borrow my microphone. Do we have questions? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, just a few kind of other variables. I think it was mentioned in the discussant just now, surely if there's been lots of displacement of people, then the ones who are left behind are usually the older generation who are going to vote in a certain way. So that's going to skew your results. Secondly, you didn't talk at all about the influence of television, which is highly important, particularly Russian TV. And if you watch Russian or Ukrainian TV, will skew the way you look at developments, particularly because Russian TV is so polarizing. Thirdly, I'm not so sure about the use of American political science methodology. For one thing, there are no political parties in Ukraine. There isn't a single one, according to our definition of political parties. So how does that affect your theoretical and empirical export of American political science to Ukraine? Fourthly, when you talk about national identity, you kind of talk about it in terms of Ukrainian or Russian. The majority identity in that region is Ukrainian-Russian, not Ukrainian or Russian. It's a dual identity, which tends to sort of flow into Soviet identity. Another factor here on identity is socioeconomic. I've seen this in my own research in Donetsk, where middle-class people tend to be more pro-Ukrainian and working class more pro-Russian. So that also, I think, is a very, very important factor. Just a final thing on the question of villages, well, villages and turnout. On villages, what villages are there in Donetsk Oblast? There are very few. It's more Luhansk there are villages. Donetsk is very urbanized. So if you accept the proposal to focus on villages, it doesn't really affect, you can't really do that in Donetsk Oblast. Final point is about turnout. Can we really trust the turnout figures from before, when the Party of Regions was in control of the region, when there was massive falsification at the local level? Because the turnout in the Donetsk region and East Ukraine prior to 2002, prior to the Party of Regions taking over, was actually very low compared to West Ukraine. It massively increased when the Party of Regions took power in the region and monopolized power, but I suspect that those figures are highly manipulated. Remember that in 2004, some regions of Donetsk received over 100% in support of Yanukovych. So when we're comparing turnout today to turnout to the past, we should be suspicious of the previous turnout figures.
Okay. Yeah. Natasha? Natalka? You can have mine.
Hi, Keith Darden, American University. I like the paper very much. It's very interesting and very impressive data collection. The question I think that it's going to be hard to overcome is that we don't know the political attitudes of the displaced people. And I wonder if there's a way to measure that directly, because we do see that there is an effect on turnout, which is, as Scott points out, likely to be a function of their being displaced. And then there's a shift in attitudes towards pro-Western parties, which may just be a function of the fact that people who were less pro-Western left. And so to know that, you have to have some mechanism for estimating the attitudes of those who departed and also the size of the population that departed. So I'm wondering how you tackle those issues.
Well, can I answer this one directly? The first two surveys, so in the first survey, there are basically no internally displaced persons because it's the rest of Ukraine, and they try to have a question on internally displaced persons, and there were only 4 people out of 1,600 that were displaced people. Also in Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, they ask people, have you been here permanent, or have you moved recently? So kind of most of the 90% of the people there are people who stayed there the whole time, and so we include that variable in the regression. And whether
more for the third of your.
Yes, for the third. Yes, for the third, it's indeed yes.
But if I may comment on the third one, we tried really hard to get the data from the Central Election Committee, and they just sent us some nonsense, non-response, like in terms of who was registered on this polling station or who was displaced, whether any military voted in this particular polling station, and they kind of very silent on that. So we couldn't get data. So that's a problem here. Yeah.
Also, on the previous questions on the turnout, I think that's also, can we trust the figures? I think Scott pointed that out, and indeed maybe we can use this methodology that tries to figure out whether there was manipulation or not and try to include that. Also on the influence of television, on May 18th, we will have a presentation by somebody who actually tried to do that, who tried to see how the television affected votes in the regions outside of the affected regions.
Is that Arturas Rosanas?
Pesach. Yes. So he will come to Kiev and will give a presentation here.
Yeah, good.
Do we have other questions? Yes? No? Okay, thank you very much, Tom, Maksym, and Scott. And now we have a short break of about 15 minutes, and then please come back. We have 2 more very exciting papers to discuss.